I cannot believe you would say that to me after everything we've been through.
My name is Clara Bennett, and at 58, I have learned that the quietest rooms often hold the strongest walls. By day, I sign off on plans that tilt the direction of 5 states' worth of operations. By night, I brew a single cup of coffee in a kitchen smaller than the conference tables where I spend my afternoons. People see the small apartment, the scuffed flats, the sedan that coughs on cold mornings, and they sketch their own conclusions between ordinary and unremarkable. I don't correct them. In a culture where volume passes for value and packaging masquerades as proof, there is freedom in being underestimated. I chose this life of simplicity, not because I couldn't afford more, but because I learned early that money can be an amplifier for either goodness or vanity. When my son, Lucas, was small enough to carry his sleep from the car to the couch, I made myself a promise. He would not grow up believing that wealth is the only language adults respect. I gave him library cards instead of luxury, questions instead of orders, Saturday mornings at the public branch instead of shopping bags filled with applause paper. Success, I told him, is worthless if it erodes your character on the way in. 3 years ago, Lucas married Samantha Reynolds, a bright woman with a smile, practiced for photographs, and a way of standing that suggested she understood 100 subtle rules about rooms I've never needed to enter. Her family is New York money, art openings where names are listed like donors on marble, vacation homes curated like museum wings, the effortless choreography of conversations that perform as much as they connect. I never begrudged them their comfort. I simply recognized the script, generosity as display, manners as currency, status recited in the gentle cadence of concern. It is not evil. It is just a way of living that confuses price with worth. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Seattle's sky unspooled its usual gray, and I was finishing a report, numbers disciplined into place, timelines tightened like sailcloth, when my phone brightened with Lucas's name. "Mom," he said, voice a shade too careful. "Samantha's parents are visiting from New York. They'd love to meet you. We're having dinner downtown this Saturday." His words came smoothly, but under them I heard the small tension of someone trying not to step on polished floors with muddy shoes. "Do they know anything about me?" I asked, as neutrally as I could. There was a pause, the kind that contains a truth. "I told them you work in an office," he said finally, "and that you like simple things." Simple. The syllables floated like a feather and landed like a stone. After we hung up, I looked around my apartment, the warm pool of light from a cheap lamp, a stack of borrowed books, the stubborn plant by the window that thrived on benign neglect. Simple isn't lack, I wanted to say aloud. Simple is a decision. Simple is a discipline. But I also heard what my son feared, that the woman who raised him on enough might not look like enough in a room trained to applaud the right signals. I slept lightly as rain stitched the night to my window, and by morning the choice had set inside me like cooling glass. I would go exactly as they expected me to be. No designer camouflage, no professional monologue to preempt their judgment, no packaged resume disguised as conversation. Not to trap anyone, not to humiliate, life does that work without our help, but to listen. To see how their kindness operated when they believed I had nothing to trade back. Sometimes the only honest way to test the architecture of someone's respect is to lean on it with your full weight. Saturday came wrapped in mist and the metallic scent that precedes a heavier rain. I stood before my closet, the navy dress softened by time, the handful of tailored suits that fit like decisions, sweaters that remembered old winters, and reached for the navy. Elbow sleeves, clean lines, nothing to announce itself. I tied back my hair, stepped into flats that had carried me through airports and boardrooms and funerals, and regarded the woman in the mirror. She could be anyone. The neighbor who waters your plants, the aunt who brings soup, the lady whose name you forget, but whose steadiness you miss when she's gone. Not the executive who keeps org charts from collapsing, not the woman whose signature who redirects trucks and payrolls. Just Clara. That would do. The taxi traced wet lines through the city. Wipers cut a tempo from the gray. Neon softened into watercolor puddles on the glass. Seattle excels at this kind of beauty, reflections that make even brick and steel look soft. We passed couples sharing umbrellas like small moving tents, a teenager sprinting across the crosswalk, a baker rolling down a grate. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. "Special night?" he asked, not nosy, just human. "A family dinner," I said, and he chuckled, not unkindly. 2 words that are always a gamble. La Maison greeted me with a curated glow, the air steeped in rosemary and expensive wine, waiters moving like calligraphy strokes, seats filled by people who have learned to laugh toward the ceiling. Near the entrance stood Lucas, checking his watch the way anxious men make time behave. He saw me and softened, kissing my cheek with a gratitude I couldn't yet place. Mom, you look nice," he said, polite, the tone of someone holding their breath around competing expectations. Samantha hugged me carefully, her perfume elegant and exact. "So glad you could make it, Mrs. Bennett," she said, using the name like a neutral veil. Behind her were Veronica and Charles Reynolds, perfectly assembled, faces arranged in the open ease of people, accustomed to making others comfortable in ways that center themselves. We sat at a window beaded with rain, the city shimmering beyond like a memory. Their conversation poured easily, a townhouse renovation that had become a parable, the moral fatigue of choosing between the Cape and Tuscany, their favorite gallery's new director, serious yet approachable, Samantha's mother pronounced, as if weighing a wine. None of it was cruel. It was simply fluent in a dialect I do not speak. When the focus turned to me, their questions were compassion the way a brooch fastens a dress, visible, tasteful, and a little heavy. Do I manage bills on my own? Is it safe to live alone at my age? Do I drive after dark? There are neighborhoods I should avoid, dear. Advice delivered like a gift, wrapped around assumptions they did not think to examine. "I'm comfortable," I said. "I enjoy the quiet." Plain truth rarely satisfies those expecting a confession. Veronica leaned in. Her diamonds translated candlelight into small declarations. "Lucas has such a generous heart," she said. "If you ever need help financially, we'd be happy to assist. Perhaps a modest allowance each month to make things easier." Lucas's eyes dropped to the table. Samantha's fingers traced the hem of her napkin as if it were a path she'd walked since childhood. In another life, I might have bristled. But offense is a fire that burns the person feeding it. Instead, I let the offer land and listened to what it revealed. Respect, I have learned, speaks clearest when it thinks it is rescuing you. The rain tapped its metronome on the window. I lifted my water and heard the ice chime against crystal like a small bell announcing the next scene. I smiled, not to perform grace, but to keep the room from mistaking restraint for fear. "Thank you," I said, and meant it in a way they might not recognize. Because their kindness had done what I came to see. It had told the truth about its own conditions. Across the table, my son looked like a boy again, the one who used to hand me his crayon drawings like bouquets, unsure which world to honor, the room's choreography or the lesson I'd spent a lifetime teaching him. Outside, Seattle deepened into night, the city shining as if from within. I could feel what was coming, not thunder, not spectacle, just the quiet rearrangement of fact and assumption, dignity set down like a second place, setting between the rosemary and the wine. This is where the story truly begins. A navy dress, a family that mistakes simplicity for lack, and a son about to relearn the difference between quiet and small. The table breathed like a stage, every place setting a small spotlight, every glass a reflective eye. Conversation moved with the ease of people who've practiced sounding spontaneous, and I let it wash over me, collecting details the way a tide gathers shells. Veronica narrated their renovation as if it were a moral text about patience. Charles praised a portfolio manager the way other men praise surgeons. Samantha stayed close to her mother's cadence, each sentence perfectly ironed. Lucas spoke in quick, careful intervals, a man trying to bridge two shores without falling into the water. I kept my hands loosely around the stem of my glass and took in the choreography. Laughter cued by glances, concern delivered as benediction, curiosity disguised as care. I've worked long enough in rooms where power wears good manners to know that intent and impact rarely arrive together. The questions, when they turned toward me, were wrapped in silk. Had I always lived alone? Did I find the city safe at my age? Was the building properly managed? Did I have someone to call if I fell ill? Each inquiry sounded like the kind of kindness that expects a small, grateful nod in return. I answered plainly, giving them no confessional chord to strike. Yes, I like the quiet. Yes, I'm comfortable. Yes, the building is well run. The waiter set down small plates as if delivering commas between thoughts. Outside, the rain refined itself from steady to fine, beating the window like a net. Veronica adjusted a bracelet and leaned in just enough to signal intimacy. "Clara, dear," she said. My first name softened into the texture of a blanket. Lucas has such a generous heart. If you ever find yourself needing a little help, nothing dramatic, we'd be more than happy to extend a hand. Perhaps a modest allowance each month. $700, say, just to make things easier. The number came out like a lifeboat lowered with ceremony. Across the table, Lucas's lashes slipped downward, and Samantha's fingers followed the edge of her napkin with muscle memory. Charles nodded in rhythm with his wife, earnest as a judge who has already reached the verdict. It was not cruel. It was practiced. It was charity as punctuation, period, and therefore you. There are moments when time lifts like a suspension bridge, and you can see every lane of traffic at once, the oncoming, the outgoing, the stalled. I could see my son at 6 years old, solemn in a library chair, tracing letters with his tongue between his teeth. My son at 16, handing me a report card he feared would disappoint me, and me telling him that numbers are not a measure of soul. My son at 26, bending himself into shapes to fit rooms that rewarded performance more than courage. I could also see Veronica at 26, learning in immaculate dining rooms that help is something you offer downward, and praise is something you accept upward. None of us were born fluent. We are all taught our dialects. 700, I repeated, tasting the syllables. There was no accusation in my voice, only curiosity. To make things easier. Veronica brightened, a woman relieved to find agreement where resistance might have lived. Yes, dear, she said, her diamonds stitching little constellations in the candlelight. We understand the strain of bills, and we'd never want Lucas and Samantha to worry. Charles added, those who have more must help those who have less, in the tone of a man, quoting scripture that has never argued back. I nodded, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. They were revealing their framework, and frameworks are gifts if you listen. They tell you exactly how a structure will hold and where it will bend. The waiter announced the halibut as if introducing an old friend. Plates arrived like low tides, leaving behind rosemary, butter, lemon. The window glossed over with vapor, the city beyond reduced to impressionist strokes. I let silence sit beside me like a trusted companion and considered the long road that had led us here. Years of choosing second-hand honesty over first-class show, of letting my work be loud so that my life could be quiet, of teaching a boy that worth measured from the inside out survives better weather. If a person's respect collapses at the absence of branding, then the respect was counterfeit to begin with. Counterfeits like to be admired in low light. Truth survives the fluorescence. Thank you, I said at last, and the words were true. It's a generous thought. Veronica reached for her glass, ready to bless the arrangement as concluded, but I kept my gaze steady and gentle. When people believe they're saving you, they will tell you who they think you are. I wasn't interested in trapping anyone. Traps require bait, and I didn't come to feed anything. I came to listen, to test the architecture. It held, exactly as designed, no malice, only hierarchy arranged like place settings. Lucas tried, then, to stitch a new thread through the evening. Mom's very capable, he said, the sentence small but brave, a boy's kite tugging at an adult sky. Samantha murmured agreement with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, Veronica replied smoothly. Of course. Capability is admirable at any age. But security, well, security is wisdom. The word age did a lot of work for her, and she let it. I kept my face the way I keep my balance on icy sidewalks, relaxed, alert, unafraid. The room around us began another soft swell, the way expensive restaurants orchestrate evenings to crest and fall without anyone noticing the conductor. a table behind us broke into laughter. Near the bar, a couple negotiated something heavy with quiet hands. I thought, absurdly, about the statistic I'd read that week. The average American household carries credit card debt north of $9,000. And yet, the market for luxury goods has never been more buoyant. We are a country very good at buying the feeling of enough while barely touching it. I wondered, briefly, if anyone at our table knew what it cost to store peace. Do you like your work? Samantha asked suddenly, as if she'd remembered a question from a friendlier script. I do, I said. I like solving things that would otherwise fall apart. She nodded, thoughtful for a heartbeat, and then her mother added, and yet it must be tiring. Offices can be brutal when you don't have advantages. She meant connections. She meant a last name that opens doors from the hinge side. She meant the kind of soft power that softens every room before you step into it. They can be, I said, but so can rooms that run on advantages. Every ecosystem has its predators. Charles laughed, appreciative. He prefers his realism neat. The check came then, tucked discreetly but unmistakably inside a leather folder, as if the evening itself were asking for a verdict. Veronica's hand floated toward it in the pantomime of generosity that rich people perform when the bill is entirely manageable and the audience is important. I didn't reach. Not yet. I looked at Lucas, and he looked at me the way sons do when the lesson might be about to arrive. I thought about all the times I had let the moment pass to keep a peace that wasn't peace at all, just quiet. Tonight, the quiet would do something different. It would name things and then refuse to argue with them. I placed my fingertips lightly on the folder but didn't open it. You know, I said, almost conversationally, I'm curious about something. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, each with its own weather front. When you gave Lucas and Samantha the down payment, I asked, and the honeymoon, how much did that come to? Veronica blinked at the shift in air, then recovered with a smile. Oh, about 40 for the house and 15 for Paris, she said. 55. We were delighted to do it. Of course, I said, and let the number sit between us like a neat little package tied with ribbon. The rest would come later, in its right moment, clean as a pane of glass. For now, I left the package on the table and returned my palm to the linen, steady as a keel. Respect, after all, is not a performance. It is the geometry of how we hold one another upright or don't when no one is clapping. Outside, the rain gathered itself again, and the window turned to mercury. I could hear my son's breathing even out, the way a man does when the ground under him goes from uncertain to known. The waiter drifted near, sensing some invisible cue. I smiled at him, then at the room, and kept my voice quiet enough to require attention. Some truths deserve to be heard at that volume. Shall we have dessert? I asked, as if the evening were not, in fact, already sweet with revelation. It is one thing to be underestimated. It is another to choose it, and to watch what blooms in the space where assumption once stood. 55, I repeated softly, as if rolling a marble in my palm. That's generous. Veronica inclined her head the way a benefactor receives applause, and Charles offered a modest shrug meant to look accidental. Lucas's fingers had stilled beside his glass. Samantha traced a small circle on the tablecloth, the gesture of a woman who has learned to polish the air between sentences. I opened the leather folder, glanced at the check without really seeing it, and closed it again. For years, I have walked through rooms where numbers rearrange the furniture of a conversation. You can tell who lives there by who reaches first. "I'm glad you did that," I said, meeting Veronica's eyes. "I like knowing what things cost." I let the sentence breathe. The candle's flame threw a tiny ship of light across my water. "It gives context." She smiled, relieved. Context, in circles like theirs, is a synonym for agreement. I didn't give her that. "That amount," I said, still easy, "is roughly what I earn in a month." Time slid for a second. You can feel it when a table loses its footing, the float before the drop. Charles's brows tucked inward, creating a small crease of audit. Samantha's mouth softened open, then closed again, a tide against her teeth. Veronica didn't blink. She had the discipline not to. "I'm sorry," Charles said, though he wasn't. He was calibrating. "Did you say in a month?" "Roughly," I answered. "Some quarters are heavier." I didn't bother with saving words. Women are told, especially past 40, to make themselves smaller in sentences so the room feels larger. Silence can be a scalpel, but sometimes a measurement is the cleanest cut. I manage operations for Titan Technologies across 5 states. Logistics, labor, compliance, union relationships, supply chain weather, what breaks and who fixes it, essentially. I turned to Lucas. "It's the office your mother likes." His eyes, my son's eyes, lifted and held, like a man offered a hand in water. Veronica placed her glass down carefully, the diamond on her ring making a bright, brief star. "That's impressive," she said, the word chosen for neutrality. Compliments can sound like condolences when they arrive late. "I didn't realize you were in senior leadership." "Regional director," I said. "Sometimes titles arrive last to their own parties." The waiter slid back into our orbit, instinct pulling him toward wherever the air needed smoothing. "Coffee? Dessert?" he asked, well-trained to throw lifelines disguised as crème brûlée. "Yes," I said, smiling up at him. "All of it. And please add a bottle of the Barolo for table 12. Compliments from the office." He returned my smile with one that contained a little awe and no confusion. Service workers always learn the truth faster. They have to. He left with a nod that felt like a hand pressed to his shoulder. Steady, steady. I set my corporate card on top of the leather folder without flourish. It was not a gavel. It was a receipt for a lesson already purchased. "Dinner's on me," I said, easily. "Consider it a courtesy from the woman you were prepared to subsidize." I kept my voice soft, the volume at which seriousness travels best. I have sat through enough meetings to know that people hear at the level they must lean toward. Lucas spoke first. "Mom." One syllable can hold 1,000 apologies. He cleared his throat, gathering himself. You forgot," I said, finishing not as rebuke, but as mercy. Simplicity isn't the same as lack. He nodded, the muscle in his jaw unclenching, the boy in him stepping back to make room for the man. Samantha's hand left the napkin and found the edge of the table instead. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, and her voice had a new shape to it, less curated. "I misread you." "No," I said. "You read the story you were handed." She absorbed that. We do not choose the first language we learn, about money, about merit, about who looks like they need saving. Unlearning is adult literacy. Veronica inhaled slowly, then exhaled on a smile that worked hard to stay graceful. "Forgive me," she said. "I made assumptions." "You practiced a habit," I replied, so gently it could be mistaken for agreement. "It works often enough that it feels like truth." Charles lifted his glass in a small salute, a man who recognizes a well-placed line even when it isn't for him. "Touché," he said. "You should try depositions," I offered. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was the sound a room makes when it realizes the ground is different than advertised and chooses not to fight gravity. Desserts arrived, a crisp-lidded crème brûlée, a lemon tart with its careful geometry, a dark chocolate, something that looked like a secret. Coffee steamed between us. I tasted mine black. Let the bitterness introduce itself the way old friends do, with honesty first. From the bar, a murmur of gratitude rose when the Barolo found its home at table 12. The small ripple returned to us like a kindness paid forward, stripped of theater. I watched the reflections in the window. Our faces doubled in rain-streaked glass, the city behind us reduced to soft constellations. I thought of the statistics I teach my mentees, how women's leadership pipelines narrow right when experience widens, how older women become invisible in the marketplace of attention while carrying systems on their backs. Invisibility can be a burden, yes. It can also be a cloak. Men in my field raise their voices. I learned to lower mine until people had to choose to hear. There is a difference between being unheard and being unhurried. "Clara," Veronica said at last, testing my name like a new spoon. "I admire what you've built." "I admire what you will unbuild," I said, and her eyes widened a fraction. "Some structures protect. Some just look like they do. You'll know which is which when you lean." She nodded, and for the first time that evening, her posture loosened by a single vertebra. The bill came back processed. The card returned to my hand like a small passport stamped. "You were here. You crossed. You may pass." I tucked it away and stood, smoothing the navy dress that remembered earlier versions of me. Samantha rose too quickly, then steadied herself with a small laugh. Lucas reached for my coat, a reflex he'd kept from boyhood, and settled it over my shoulders. "You taught me better," he said under his breath. "You're remembering," I answered. It is a generous verb. It lets us measure in moments, not verdicts. At the door, the maître d' thanked me by name. Names matter. They are the first dignity and the last. Outside, the rain had gentled to a silver mist. The city reflected itself on sidewalks like a painter's study in duplicates. The valet offered to call a cab. I accepted. We waited together inside the soft percussion of drizzle. Veronica stepped up beside me, not quite shoulder to shoulder. "If you're willing," she said, "I'd like to." She stopped, searching for a word that didn't exist in her old lexicon. To learn. Start with listening, I said. To people who don't need anything from you. It landed. She understood the assignment. The taxi pulled to the curb with a low, wet sigh. I turned to Lucas and touched his cheek with 2 fingers, the way I used to check for fevers. Samantha reached for my hand. Her grip was warm and human. "Thank you," she said, and the words didn't perform. They worked. "Good night," I told them both. "Get home safe." I slid into the back seat. The driver met my eyes in the mirror, a question already softening into recognition. Perhaps I looked lighter. Truth is a weight until you set it down where it belongs. As we pulled away, La Maison receded into a watercolor, and the city gathered me up in its damp, forgiving arms. Neon smeared the glass into harmless galaxies. Pedestrians surfaced and sank beneath umbrellas. I angled my face toward the window and let the cool ghost of rain reach me through the pane. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't argued or itemized. I had simply named the shape of things and then left them to stand or fall on what they were. "Rough night?" the driver asked, kindly. "Not rough," I said. "Reordered." He nodded, wise in the way people get from carrying strangers between beginnings and endings. "That's usually how it goes with family," he said. I watched the city's lights blink like small, brave affirmations and thought about the invoice for peace. It is expensive until you realize the price is silence put to honest use. By the time the taxi turned onto my street, the rain had become a fine haze, and the sidewalks shone with the dignity of clean. I paid the fare, tipped well, the economy of gratitude matters, and stepped out into a night that sounded like applause heard through a wall. I lifted my chin, breathed in the metal bright air, and let the quiet lay itself over me like a earned coat. The truth had done its work. Tomorrow could do the rest. The driver's eyes found me in the mirror the way streetlights find puddles, brief, accurate, without insistence. "You look lighter," he said, not as a question. "Sometimes the truth weighs less when you put it where it belongs," I answered. He grinned, not at me, but with me, as if he had been present for 100 versions of the same evening in 100 different cities. Windshield wipers kept a patient tempo. Outside, Seattle folded into soft geometries, neon pulled into commas by the rain, storefronts closing one metal rib at a time, a pair of teenagers sharing a hoodie like a moving tent. We passed a late bus sighing at the curb and a nurse in scrubs hurrying toward the night shift, coffee lifted like a small shield. The city was doing what cities do, holding stories side by side without ever making them compete. I let my thoughts settle like silt after a hard rain. I wasn't triumphant. Triumph is loud, performative, the kind of victory that demands mirrors. What I felt was alignment, a quiet hush along the spine when your outer life catches up to your inner ledger. For years, I have bent my days toward the same thesis. Wealth is a tool, not a trophy. Dignity is a habit, not a posture. Tonight had been a practical exam, and no one had needed to fail for the lesson to land. Even Veronica's offer, $700 lowered into the evening like a ceremonial lifeboat, looked different from this angle. It was less an insult than a diagnosis of a culture that calls hierarchy help and mistakes volume for value. We slid past a strip of restaurants, bright rooms curated like good photo albums. Through a window, I caught a flash of a birthday, sparklers sketching temporary crowns in the air, a table of friends singing off-key and not caring. My mind drifted to Lucas at 10, cheeks full of cake, brown frosting smudged like war paint, the proud wobble of a boy trying to blow out candles faster than his wishes could multiply. He had wanted a science kit that year, and I bought it with overtime and with joy. He mixed solutions all afternoon and declared himself chief of reactions. Years later, standing in the hallway after his college graduation, he'd hugged me the way men do when they don't want to cry in photographs. "You did it," he said then, "and I didn't correct the grammar of love." Tonight, I thought, was just another reaction, different reagents, same lesson, precipitating out of the solution. At a red light, the driver tapped the radio until soft jazz folded into the car. "Family?" he asked, an entire paragraph distilled to 2 syllables. "Always," I said. "They test the scaffolding." He nodded in that way people do when they've driven enough midnights to map the interior streets of other people. "Good scaffolding holds even when folks lean wrong," he said. It landed with the clean weight of a truth. Then the light blinked green, and we moved. On my block, the rain loosened into mist, and the sidewalks shone with a freshly washed kind of dignity. I paid the fare, tipped well, the working grammar of gratitude should be fluent, and stepped out into air that smelled faintly of metal and rosemary carried from some earlier kitchen. The building door offered its quiet, familiar resistance before yielding. The elevator hummed an unremarkable song. In my apartment, I left the lights low. Silence was the right company. I took off the navy dress, the fabric released me without complaint, and hung it where it belonged. The kettle breathed, then sang. I poured the water and let the tea grow dark without rushing it. Through the blinds, the city dilated and narrowed, endless small pupils adjusting to one another. I sat at the small table that has hosted report deadlines and half-finished crosswords and one potted plant's stubborn survival. My hands wrapped the warm mug and found their home there. I thought of all the rooms where I had chosen to be underestimated, and all the rooms where that choice had given me vision instead of visibility. In some places, women my age vanish. In the right ones, we become the load-bearing walls. I have no appetite for spectacle. Quiet lets me sort signal from noise, and when I speak, I prefer it to be a sentence that rearranges the furniture and then leaves the room before anyone can put it back the old way. When I finally slept, it was the good kind, no rehearsals, no rewrites. Morning arrived with a filtered sunlight that made even the dust look deliberate. The rain had polished the city, and the city had decided to keep shine for a while. I brewed coffee strong enough to stand on its own feet, and opened the window just enough to let the cool air tap my cheek like a conspirator. Peace is the one luxury most people can't afford because they think it has a price. It doesn't. It has a practice. The phone buzzed. "Lucas." I let it ring twice, then 3 times, not to punish, simply to breathe. The 4th vibration reminded me of him at 4, tugging my sleeve with the persistence of rain. I answered. "Mom," he said, the word dropping into the room with the weight of a backpack sliding from sore shoulders. The breath he took after it wasn't a sigh, it was a reset. "I'm sorry." The old instinct to jump in and absorb, to lay cushions under a falling confession, rose and then receded. I let silence open a chair beside us. When people are brave enough to tell the truth, you don't interrupt the building. He began again, words careful at first, then truer. "After you left, they tried to explain. They always do. Good intentions and whatnot." But I heard it, finally. What it sounds like when people call their assumptions kindness. He exhaled. "I told them you didn't need their charity, and I told them I was ashamed of how I sat there and let it happen. Not of you, of me." The last syllable landed like a key turned the correct direction. I closed my eyes and saw him at 6, glasses too big on his face, clutching a paper where he'd written his name without help for the first time. "I see you," I had told him then. "You remembered," I said now, and he understood that I meant the important thing, the scaffolding. "I did," he said, voice roughening. Samantha cried. She said she sounded like her mother without knowing it. "She wants to. She asked if she could come talk to you. Apologize. Not the public kind, the kitchen table kind." The impulse to end it here with something like, "It's okay," cheap mercy, immediate relief, knocked softly. I didn't answer the door. Relief is not the same as repair. "I heard your apology," I said, keeping my tone level as a countertop. "Keep going with the courage part." He laughed once, short and sheepish. "I deserve that. I'm going to do better. I want to do better around you, but also not only around you." "Good," I said. "We build the habit, not the performance." A pause opened, companionable. "Can she come by?" he asked, softer now. "Not today," I said, and felt both our shoulders settle at the boundary. "But soon." When she isn't trying to outrun embarrassment, when she's moving toward understanding. He accepted that with the grace I raised him to prefer over speed. "Mom," he said after a beat, "last night, when you put your card down," he stopped. I felt like a boy whose mother just moved a mountain without shaking the ground. I smiled. I didn't move anything. I pointed. Mountains don't need our force. They need our names. He made the low sound men make when they are giving themselves permission not to hide their tenderness. "I love you," he said. "Don't say it to feel better," I answered, "because I will not waste a teachable moment by letting it become a soft one. Live it. In small, boring ways. The kind that stack up." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and we both laughed at the ma'am like we always do when he needs to feel young on purpose. We said goodbye the way people do when the next conversation has already started in their heads, and I set the phone on the table, screen down, as if to let the morning see my face instead of glare. Outside, a child stomped through a leftover puddle and then examined his own splash with scientific concentration. A woman across the street shook a rug over her railing and sent a brief galaxy of dust into the air. The sun caught it and turned it generous. Somewhere a delivery truck thumped a rhythm into the curb. My apartment held its clean, ordinary air. I rinsed the coffee cup and watched the water braid itself down the drain. On my desk sat the slim journal I keep for nights that reorder the furniture. I opened to a fresh page. I don't chronicle events, I distill equations. Last night's formula was simple enough to fit in a margin. Power that needs applause is theater. Power that holds still is structure. I wrote it once, then again, until the letters understood themselves. Before closing the book, I added a line for the mentees who sit with me after hours in a conference room that still smells faintly of printer ink and ambition. When people underestimate you, don't spend your life correcting their math. Build the bridge, walk it, and wave from the other side. They'll update their numbers when they need to cross. I capped the pen, set the journal down, and let the morning wrap around me like a sweater borrowed from an older sister who knows your shape. My phone, face down, stayed quiet. The kettle, empty, cooled to usefulness again. The day waited without demands. There would be knocks soon enough, repairs to start, apologies to host, new Sundays to plan. For now, the city breathed, and so did I, aligned, unhurried, willing. 3 days later, I heard the gentlest knock, 3 small taps that sounded like someone asking permission of the wood itself. When I opened the door, Samantha stood there holding a thin bouquet of daisies. No lacquered hair, no camera-ready posture. Just a beige sweater, clean jeans, and a face that had practiced honesty in the mirror all morning. She smiled the way people do when they are stepping onto a bridge they hope will hold. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, and caught herself. "Clara, may I come in?" "Of course," I answered, stepping aside. The apartment received her without theatrics. Sunlight was filtering through the blinds in measured lines, laying a quiet geometry across the floor. She looked around, at the book stacked spines out on the table, at the plant in the window that refuses to quit, at the navy dress, now resting on the back of a chair like a retired soldier. "It's peaceful," she said, as if the word were a discovery and not a category. "That's the point," I said. "Peace is a choice you make and remake." She placed the daisies in the sink and reached for a glass to turn into a vase, moving with the tidy competence of someone raised to be useful in other people's kitchens. Her hands trembled, just slightly. "I came to apologize," she began, and then stopped, as if she'd found the wrong starting line and needed to back up. "I came to tell you I'm sorry for how I treated you, and for what I let my parents say while I laughed at the right places." I gestured to the table. We sat. I didn't rescue her with easy phrases. In a culture obsessed with speed, patience can feel like cruelty. It isn't. It's scaffolding for the truth. I grew up in rooms where help always went down and praise always went up, she said, lining the daisies by sight into a small choreography. Where kindness was something you performed in heels and linen and learned to deliver with the right tilt of the head. I thought I was being nice. I didn't realize I was being condescending. The word arrived intact. It took work to carry. "This is how scripts work," I said. "We learn them at the table we're given. It's brave to hear yourself and choose a rewrite." She looked relieved and also chastened, two feelings that don't often share a plate. When you put down your card the other night, she said, I heard my own voice the way you must hear it. Bright. Polite. Wrong. I felt small. She met my eyes. I don't want to be that kind of small. Smallness, I said, is when your sense of worth needs a ceiling to feel tall. Humility is different. It can stand outdoors. She smiled then, surprised by the mercy of a sentence. I want humility, she said. The kind that doesn't need to rehearse. We made tea, the unpretentious kind that forgives water that isn't exactly the right temperature, and the apartment expanded to fit conversation. She asked about my work. Not the title, not the salary, not the elevator pitch. The work. Supply chains and winter storms, truckers and night shift supervisors, the way a missed gasket can delay 3 states' worth of deliveries. She listened like a student, taking notes without a pen. I like solving what would otherwise fall apart, I said at one point. That's exactly what I envy, she admitted. I've been good at curating things that are already arranged. Galleries, events, itineraries. But putting my hands on something messy and making it sturdy, that's different. I can see why Lucas breathes better when he leaves here. Rooms should let you breathe, I said. Otherwise they're museums. Silence arrived and wasn't awkward. It sat with us like a third chair that knew when to lean back. Samantha's eyes traveled the surfaces of my small life, as if reading captions under photographs. I used to think happiness was expensive, she said softly. It's often noisy, I answered. Happiness can be a party. Peace is the thing that remains when the lights go out. She nodded, chewing on the idea like good bread. I've been thinking, she said, about the way we use words like simple as if they were synonyms for less. I told Lucas your life was simple because I didn't have language for deliberate. Language follows attention, I said. If you start noticing the right things, you'll find the words. I want to, she said, and there were tears in her voice now, not because she wanted pity, but because the ground had moved under her feet, and she was choosing not to reach for the old furniture. I want to be a different kind of person in rooms like that. Around you. Around myself. Then begin, I said. Not with apologies, those are cheap. Begin with practices. I pointed at the daisies. You bought flowers that don't show off. Good start. She laughed, a sound released from somewhere behind her ribs. Tell me what practices, she urged. Please. Listen more than you perform, I said. Ask a question and wait longer than is comfortable. Learn the names of people whose names don't get learned. Tip well enough to feel it. Carry cash for the moments electronic gratitude can't reach. Leave a room better than you found it. And every time you feel yourself wanting to rescue someone for the pleasure of being needed, ask if what you're offering is respect or control. She took this in like weather, eyes bright with the sting and promise of it. That last one, she said. I know that one. My mother wraps control in monogrammed towels. She was handed those towels, I said. You were handed them, too. Fold them differently. We spoke then about mothers and daughters, about the choreography of wealth that looks like ease and feels like pressure. about the American habit of buying the feeling of enough while carrying balances that whisper otherwise. I mentioned a statistic, how more than a third of households can't cover a $400 emergency without borrowing, and yet we rank our worth by square footage and table reservations. Samantha winced, not from defensiveness, but from recognition. "I've been fluent in the wrong numbers," she said. "Learn new ones," I answered. "Count what steadies." She reached across the table then, palm open, an invitation without demand. I met it halfway. Her hand was warm. "I hope you can forgive me," she said, a sentence built from small bricks laid carefully. "Forgiveness doesn't need time," I told her. "It needs understanding." I squeezed once, not as absolution, but as assignment accepted. "You've started?" She exhaled, and something let go inside the room, an old tense wire, a thread pulled free. "Thank you," she said, "for not humiliating me. You could have." "I don't confuse justice with theater," I said. "Besides, humiliation teaches people to hide better. Understanding teaches them to change." She stood, gathering nothing, leaving nothing out of place. At the door, she paused. "Lucas wants to make Sundays a tradition," she said, almost shy. "Groceries, stories, nothing fancy." "Nothing fancy travels farther," I said. "Tell him to bring bread." After she left, the apartment kept the shape of her visit the way a pond holds the last ripple. I washed the teacups and set them upside down to dry, their small mouths catching sunlight. On the table, the daisies recalibrated the air, modest, cheerful, unafraid of being ordinary. I sat with them a while and thought about repair, the kind that doesn't glitter for photographs, but holds the weight of actual traffic. My phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. "How did it go?" I typed back. "We began." He sent a heart, then another message. "I'll bring bread." I imagined his face at the bakery, indecisive in the presence of options, and smiled. Couple change one small purchase at a time. Before I returned to work, I opened the journal and drew a simple diagram, 2 circles, kindness and respect, overlapping just a little. In the space where they met, I wrote, "Offer help that doesn't assume helplessness." Underneath, "For the women I mentor after hours," I added, "Apologies are words. Repair is architecture. Build what can carry weight in the rain." Outside, the city prepared another gray afternoon, the honest kind that makes the lights inside look warmer. I tucked the daisies into the borrowed glass, set them by the stubborn plant, and felt the room breathe around its new arrangement. Peace is often just this, the clean click of things settling where they belong. The knock had been gentle, the leaving was quieter. In the residue, I realized I felt not taller but truer, and there is a difference. The old scripts will still speak. The new practices will answer. On Sunday, there will be bread. We will slice it at this table and let the crumbs make their harmless mess. And as the steam rises from the crust, we will name what we are building, not a performance, not a posture, but a family with better scaffolding. Repair doesn't announce itself. It holds. The first Sunday arrived like a small unwrapped gift, no ribbon, just usefulness. Lucas texted a photo from the bakery. 2 loaves, 1 rustic and open crumbed, 1 neat and sandwich ready. Both, I replied. He sent back an exaggerated sigh and a grainy selfie with the paper bag clutched like contraband. Samantha's message followed. We're bringing soup starters. Nothing fancy. Nothing fancy has become our family dialect. It travels farther. They came just before noon, all weather and smiles. Lucas bent to unlace his shoes like a boy who still remembers the rules of this apartment. Samantha shuffled in with a tote that clinked faintly. On the table, the daisies had relaxed into themselves, a good omen. We fell into tasks without assigning them, water on for stock, carrots surrendered to coins, an onion cut in even squares that turned clear at the edges. If you pay attention, kitchens will teach you everything you need to know about hierarchies and grace, who reaches for the knife without announcing it, who wipes the counter when no one is looking, who asks whether the time should go in now or later and really wants to learn why. Lucas set the bread down and breathed in with reverence. Smells like a church I actually like, he said, tearing a heel. Samantha laughed and then checked herself with mock seriousness. We wait, she said, and I watched her find the pleasure in that sentence. The difference between performance and practice is often measured in minutes. We ate with spoons that clinked softly and the conversational ease that doesn't need to audition for the room. Lucas told a story about a coworker who insists on copying him on emails that have no need of his name. Samantha described abandoning the algorithm of her favorite social platform for an entire week and discovering the shape of her attention without bait. I talked about the winter intake we were preparing for. Storms in the Dakotas that would reroute entire supply lines. Truckers I've known by first name and coffee preference for a decade. The forklift whisperer in Spokane, who can hear a bearing going bad the way musicians hear an instrument drift. Is this what peace tastes like? Samantha asked, nodding at her bowl. Peace tastes like enough, I said. And you can season it. Outside, rain rehearsed its many registers against the city, from brush to snare. We moved to the window between courses and watched people cross the street in shared umbrellas, couples negotiating which shoulder gets the wind. There is a statistic I keep in my pocket for nights when the building feels full of strangers. One recent study found that nearly half of adults report frequent feelings of loneliness, even with phones buzzing like beehives. I mention it now, and Samantha looks stricken in the tender way of someone recognizing the exact ache. I've never been lonely on purpose before, she says. Just lonely around. Lucas puts an arm around her in that old-fashioned way that leaves no room for irony. We add habits one Sunday at a time. When dishes are done, we each keep a fork on the counter, an intentional leftover, to remind ourselves there is always a little more to learn, to taste, to try again. When Lucas forgets and puts his fork away, he takes it back out and grins like a boy caught rearranging the rules, then returns it to the counter. This is how practice works: imperfect, iterative, good-humored. Later, we take a walk in light rain, the kind that politely asks your hair to reconsider itself. Samantha carries the paper bag of breadcrumbs for the pond. Lucas kicks a pine cone down 3 consecutive blocks without losing it once. In the park, a toddler negotiates with a pigeon, both parties entirely sincere. We sit on a damp bench and let the city show us what it knows. That ordinary afternoons teach more than grand pronouncements. That credit and mercy accrue in small deposits. There is another statistic for my mentees. Consumer spending on experiences now outpaces spending on goods, yet household debt climbs anyway. We live in a time that buys both the story and the receipt. What if our new experiences are boring on purpose, I suggest, so they can afford themselves? Samantha squeezes my hand. I want boring to become a skill, she says, and Lucas, mock offended, says, I object to being boring. We amend it, practiced, present, steady. Precision matters. The mentorship circle at work grows on its own timetable, the way hardy plants do. On Wednesday evenings, when the floor has emptied and the printers hum like crickets, a handful of women pull chairs into the small conference room that overlooks the water. We are a ragged chorus, a single mother from inventory who writes code at night without telling anyone, a first-generation college graduate with a laugh that repairs moods, an older temp who brings hard candy and harder truths about quitting too late. Grace shows up early, as she does, the careful student of her own life. She asks the question she always asks, a liturgy now. What do we do about underestimation? Stop spending capital on correction, I say. Invest in competence. Make your receipts undeniable. Invisible is not the same as trivial. We talk about the broken rung that pushes women out of management before they get the title they already occupy by labor. How every data set we examine tells a similar story. Pipelines narrow just as experience widens. We practice what I call lowering your voice so people have to choose to hear. The escalator trick for meetings where volume auditions for authority. And we keep a running list on the whiteboard titled Assets That Don't Show Up on the Org Chart, Reliable Childcare Swaps, the Forklift Whisperer's phone number, a supervisor who posts schedules early, a quiet colleague who knows where every fuse box lives. This week, I sketched the Venn diagram I drew after Samantha's visit, kindness and respect, overlapping just a little. Stay here, I tell them, tapping the middle. Offer help that doesn't assume helplessness. Grace writes it down with a concentration that makes me want to be worthy of my own sentences. When we break, the room smells like citrus cleaner and resolved in tension. They leave their chairs slightly askew. I never straighten them. Not every room needs to be returned to default. At home, my journal collects new equations. Peace, Fabichoa practice. Applause. Influence x restraint, editor structure. These are not aphorisms for a wall calendar. They are tools I sharpen with use. Samantha borrows the journal one Sunday and copies the diagrams on index cards she keeps in her purse. Flashcards, she says, embarrassed and proud. Is it childish? It's disciplined, I answer. Children are experts in starting again. We accumulate proof that change can prefer the mundane. The next Sunday, Samantha arrives without makeup and doesn't apologize to the air for it. Lucas silences a work call and does not narrate his virtue. We set the table with mismatched plates because the last two matching plates met their end against a tiled floor, and nobody sends a condolence card for dinnerware. We bless the food and the fact that blessing is a verb you can conjugate in silence. When they leave, the apartment holds their warmth, the way wool holds body heat, unshowy, efficient. I rinse the cups and angle them on the rack. On the counter, I keep our ritual fork. Small practices keep the larger scaffolding true. Not every call is easy. There's a Tuesday when Lucas sounds tight again, pressure at work, a mistake that isn't entirely his. In another era, he might have converted that strain into a performance at dinner, loudness as proof. Now he tells me first, and we do the math together. Make a plan, I say. Name the error precisely. Own your part. Offer the fix. Don't audition humility. Embody accountability. He writes it on a sticky note and then texts me a photo of the note on his monitor. Adult literacy, he captions it. I pin it to the board for my mentees. Credit given. Lesson portable. Samantha's parents hover at the edge of these new pages. Veronica sends an email with 3 sentences and 1 soft landing. She is learning how to speak without scaffolding her sentences in velvet. Charles drops off a book about leadership that is better than I expected and worse than it thinks it is. I write a thank you note in ink that doesn't apologize and invite them for a Sunday next month. Nothing fancy, I add in parentheses, then delete the parentheses. We mean what we say now. On a late Sunday, rain refuses to show and the city wears a pale blue, unlikely sky. We open the windows. The soup becomes salad. The bread goes to crumbs over tomatoes that taste like the color red. We leave the forks on the counter and eat with our hands because sometimes that's the right tool. When the light begins to lower itself into evening, Lucas stands to take the plates to the sink and pauses. "Mom," he says, and the word is the same as in every era, only steadier. "Thank you for this." He means the scaffolding, the practice, the room where he can be unfinished and welcome. "Bring the forks," I say, and he laughs. Samantha holds up her index card. Today's note, quiet is not small. It's measured. On the walk to the elevator, they make plans without asking me to approve them. That's new. Growth, unsupervised, is trust. I close the door after they go and listen to the apartment settle, the building sighing its old pipes, the city shedding another layer of noise. The daisies have finally leaned past their prime, heads heavy with the honesty of having done their best. I retire them to the compost, rinse the glass, and set it beside the ritual fork, space waiting for the next ordinary grace. Peace is not an achievement, it's alignment you renew. We are renewing it, one bowl, one boundary, one practiced silence at a time. Outside, the sky keeps its blue. Inside, the room keeps its shape. The scaffolding holds. Months are a quiet architect. Brick by unnoticed brick, they raise something you can lean against. By late spring, the city had traded its steel gray overcoat for a jacket it could forget it was wearing. The Sundays kept coming. The soup became salad. The stew became a pan of roasted vegetables that tasted like their own names. Lucas arrived with a new way of standing in rooms, less triangulated by other people's expectations. Samantha carried a tote that clinked less and rustled more. Bread, greens, a book she was actually reading instead of displaying. Peace had learned our address and stopped knocking before it came in. At work, the mentorship circle settled into itself the way a choir learns when to breathe. Grace took notes with fewer apologies between the lines. The inventory coder announced to the room and to herself that she was applying for a role no one had told her she could have. She brought a resume like a blueprint. I taught them a phrase I've carried in my pocket for 20 years. Don't confuse access with ability. Then we practiced the most subversive skill older women can offer younger ones, ending a sentence without raising our pitch to ask for permission none of us needed in the first place. Samantha asked if she could sit in one evening. She came early, took a chair near the whiteboard, and listened without rearranging her face to look helpful. When we broke, she wiped the table in small circles, the way people do when their hands are still catching up to their hearts. I thought leadership was decoration, she admitted, almost embarrassed by the accuracy. Turns out it's housekeeping. The room laughed, glad to recognize itself in a better metaphor. Veronica sent an email that didn't audition for kindness. She wrote, "We would like to visit, if you'll have us." No itinerary. No restaurant name italicized in advance. When they came, she wore flats and brought pears. Charles carried nothing but the habit of making space near doors where other people might pass. We ate simply, the pears sliced with the attention you reserve for something that has finally learned to be enough. At one point, Veronica touched the rim of her glass and said, carefully, "When I offered the allowance, I thought I was being generous." She looked up and kept looking. I was being theatrical. No one rescued the moment with a joke. The room let it breathe until it found its balance. "Thank you," I told her, "for rehearsing less." She smiled a small, honest smile, the kind you can't wear with diamonds. We are not a different family. We are the same family with a different scaffolding. Lucas still forgets his keys. Samantha still tears up at surprising commercials. I still misplace my reading glasses in the exact spots no one would think to check. But the corrections have changed. We fix what bends by naming it without indictment, by adding a brace here, a quiet habit there. The ritual fork remains on the counter even when we're eating takeout. It is our pledge to keep a little room for learning. It is not sacred. It is just sturdy. On an ordinary Tuesday that smelled like rain and printer ink, Grace knocked on my office door with the urgent happiness of someone who has caught a train. "I got it," she said, and held out the email like a passport stamped. She'd been promoted into a role strangers had once suggested she wasn't quite ready for. I asked her what she would do first. "Fix the schedule," she said. "Post it early." Everyone sleeps better when time tells the truth. I wrote it on the whiteboard for the group. Everyone sleeps better when time tells the truth. Then I sent a photo to Lucas and Samantha because wisdom travels faster when it is fed. That night, after the building emptied and the water outside collected, the last light with patient hands, I stayed in the small conference room and opened my journal. I wrote what the months had distilled. Real power doesn't arrive with symbols. It is the beam that does not sag when weather changes. It listens when others perform. It forgives without forgetting the blueprint. Under that, almost as an afterthought, I added the sentence I'd carried home from the rain all those weeks ago. Money fades. Dignity doesn't. On the next Sunday, we ate on plates that didn't match and didn't mind. Samantha read aloud from an article about loud budgeting, a trend where people announce their refusals to spend as a kind of public virtue. I appreciate the intention, she said, but I don't want my boundaries to need an audience. Lucas nodded, tearing bread with neat confidence. We can afford quiet, he said, and I couldn't have written it better for him. Outside the window, the neighborhood continued its unremarkable miracles. Scooters left exactly where children promised they would leave them. An old man checking his mailbox twice because the muscle memory hadn't gotten the memo from the empty slot. A couple practicing patience on opposite ends of a couch. When they rose to wash, Samantha paused with the towel in her hands. "Do you ever wish you'd flashed it?" she asked, vaguely embarrassed to even shape the thought. The resume, the numbers, the rooms you walk through? Just once? For sport? I pictured the corporate card heavy as a sentence, the way a table hushes itself when a woman refuses to audition. "There's a cost to spectacle," I said. "I prefer to spend on structure." She looked relieved, less by my certainty than by the fact that certainty can be this quiet and still count. After we cleaned the kitchen, Lucas stood by the window with a dish he'd dried to absurd perfection. "Mom," he said, the word now less boy and more bridge. "I used to think your silence meant you didn't care. Now it sounds like something that holds." He rested the plate on the counter and left it there on purpose. "Structure over spectacle," he added, and we laughed, because slogans are only useful if they taste like real life when you bite them. Later, when the apartment had released their warmth, the way wool does, slowly, saving some for later, I took a walk alone. Seattle likes to wear a film of silver over its evenings. It flatters everyone. I passed restaurants humming their curated hum, people erecting little theaters with their hands, a teenager lifting his skateboard and setting it down again, like punctuation he was still learning to use. The city held its million simultaneous rehearsals without insisting I choose one. I sat on a bench that remembered the shape of winter and watched the ordinary holiness of people going home. I don't know if Veronica will ever abandon the pleasure of a name on a donor wall. I don't know if Charles will stop believing that the correct voice can make a room reasonable. I don't know if Lucas will remember, every time, to leave his fork. I don't know if Samantha will keep index cards in her purse for years, or if she'll forget them in a coat and find them on some future spring day, with a smile that forgives her own delay. What I know is this: we have chosen our scaffolding. It is built out of small habits that do not photograph well. It holds. If you have listened this far, thank you. Stories like this are not about villains conquered and parades earned. They are about the math of respect done out loud, the geometry of families learning to carry one another without applause. I wish you health, the kind that is more than a number, and happiness that does not need an audience. I wish your home the quiet that lets you hear your own good voice. If this story gave you something to hold, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and share it with someone who's been told that simplicity is a synonym for less. It isn't. Sometimes it's just the right size for dignity. Money fades. Dignity doesn't.